very warm welcome from my side, to our last CCNB seminar this year. So it's a really great pleasure to have Philipp here, and there would be like a very short introduction to him. I would say, there are few outstanding cognitive neuroscientists. There are few like really exceptional physicians, and it's pretty rare to find someone who's both, and this is Philipp, But to give you a bit more background, so Philipp studied medicine in Munich and did his PhD there at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry. And then he moved on to Frankfurt, where he did his specialization in neurology and worked there already like in neuroimaging, did some outstanding work in vision together with Andreas Kleinschmidt. From there, he got his own grant to join Gernot Rees Group at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience and the Functional Imaging Laboratory in London, where he also pursued doing fantastic work in vision neuroscience, but also really became pretty interested in also like how our beliefs are influencing our perception. But there are a wonderful study together with Chris Frith, which was pretty famous, on biology. And then from there, stayed there only I think 2 years or so, he moved on to the Charité, to the psychiatry department, got his own grant, huge grant, for establishing his group, vision group. There was a Minota grant, and worked further on vision, but also became more interested in computational cognitive neuroscience, especially computational psychiatry, and also did his specialization now in psychiatry and psychotherapy, which he also finished. Pretty achievement. 2 specialization in medicine. I even like finished not one. Now then also he became professor in 2011 at the Charité Psychiatry Department. And unfortunately for us, I think fortunate for him, he is now the head of a psychiatry department in Basel. So a couple of months ago, he left Berlin, which is really a pity here for the science community, but there's still some kind of interaction going on. In addition to his really amazing, outstanding, so he published numerous papers work, he has also written at least, from what I know, 2 books, one about like explaining the brain for kids, and the other pretty recent one about beliefs. So Philipp, it's really fantastic, great having you here, and I'm looking very much forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Timo and Felix, for the invitation, first of all, and for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here again and give a talk in this fantastic series that you put together. And I'm gonna now share my screen. Hopefully this works now the way it's supposed to work. Okay. All right, so what I want to talk about today is a predictive processing account of psychosis. And I want to start with a very dry but important definition. The definition of the word psychosis. According to the NIMH information website on psychosis, the word psychosis is used to describe conditions that affect the mind, where there has been some loss of contact with reality. During a period of psychosis, a person's thoughts and perceptions are disturbed, and the individual may have difficulty understanding what is real and what is not. So I highlighted a couple of words here. First, thoughts and perceptions. That is important because it refers to 2 important groups of symptoms. Thoughts refers to delusions primarily, and perceptions to hallucinations and also some other abnormalities of perception. but these are the two main symptom groups of psychosis: delusions and hallucinations. And the other thing I highlighted is the difficulty understanding what is real and what is not. This is, of course, a well, philosophically deep statement, because it's not so easy to know what is real and what is not. This is also, I think, one of the main problems with defining psychosis and defining, when somebody is delusional or not. I just want to highlight this in the beginning, because it is something we always have to keep in mind as a relevant problem in defining psychosis. So how do we know at all what is real and what is not? René Descartes, who you all know and probably some of you read, had this idea that we can know what is real because the reality is somehow projected into our brains, and then the pineal body gives rise to some conscious percept, which tells us what is going on out there. Now, this is very much in line with the intuitions that we have. Most of us go around the world and think, have the intuition that there are some like two cameras in their head, and they project a picture of the world into our heads. But for several reasons that I'm not going into in detail, this is something that doesn't work. Rather, as Helmholtz, as one of the first scientists put it, perception, and more generally how we understand the world, is by making inferences about the causes of the sensory data. So this is a quotation from Peter Dayan from his famous paper in 1995, one of the first computational models for how inference actually works. So he said, following Helmholtz, we view the human perceptual system as a statistical inference engine whose function is to infer the probable causes of sensory input. So perception is not a projection into the head, but it's an inference, an active process that the brain does by actually making interpretations of the sensory input data that are registered by the sensory organs. This is just to illustrate the concept of inference, because usually we're not aware of that process, but we become aware of this inferential nature of our perception when looking at visual illusions. This is a very impressive version of the size illusion or Ponzo illusion, where these three cars really look quite different in size, but when you put a meter onto them, you will see that they're actually physically exactly the same size, though the context knowledge here makes our brains infer these cars to be different in size, even though they're actually not. Another impressive example is the hollow face illusion. So here you see two versions of a mask. The left version is where you look onto the mask from the front, and the right one is where you look into the mask from the back. And most of you will probably see these two masks as convex, so bulging outwards, even though the actual physical the sensory cues that you get on the right-hand side are suggesting that you're looking into a hollow face, which, however, we do not perceive because we have a very strong a priori that faces are convex rather than concave. So our brains infer a convex face here, and the strange shading then can be, for example, attributed to lighting from below rather than above, as on the left-hand side. So these two instances of perception as inference, and this concept is has been very influential, not only generally in neuroscience, but particularly also in psychiatric neuroscience, because it enables us to use a computational framework to actually understand psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. And here is just one paper that was extremely influential in putting forward this view of psychosis as an abnormality of inference by Paul Fletcher and Chris Frith, Perceiving is Believing, a Bayesian approach to explaining the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So the positive symptoms are hallucinations and delusions, among some others. And they famously proposed that positive symptoms of schizophrenia are caused by an abnormality in the brain's inferencing mechanisms within a Bayesian framework. So what is the general idea here? The idea is that prior knowledge in the form of prior beliefs is combined with the sensory evidence to actually compute a so-called posterior. So in Bayesian terms, the prior belief is just called the prior. The sensory evidence is expressed as a likelihood, and the combination of the two into a posterior belief is called posterior. And these are all expressed as probability distributions. And the important thing here is that these probability distributions can have different widths. As you can see here, for the prior and the likelihood, for example, the prior is pretty narrow and the likelihood is rather flat and broad. And the width of this probability distribution is inversely related to the precision of these estimations, which means in this example here that the prior is considered highly precise, which is expressed by this narrow distribution, which means we have a very strong belief that a face is convex, whereas the likelihood here with this flat distribution means that we have a rather weak sensory evidence or weak estimate of the sensory evidence that the face is actually concave. Now, these precisions are extremely important in computing the posterior because the posterior will be more influenced by the distribution that is narrower, so by the distribution with the higher precision. In that case here, you can see that it's indeed more influenced by the prior, which results in a posterior that says that this is a convex face. So this is the inference that the observer then makes. Now, the idea for psychosis is that there is actually a shift in this balance between the estimation of the prior and the estimation of the likelihood, which then also has an influence on how the posterior is computed. So the theoretical idea is that the prior is relatively too imprecise and the likelihood is relatively too precise, which results in this shift here. So if that is the case, the posterior will be likely to be influenced more strongly by the likelihood, so the sensory evidence, and less by the prior, which in that case here could result in the posterior saying this is a concave face, which corresponds to a percept of a concave face. And in fact, there is evidence for the hollow face illusion that people with schizophrenia and other forms of psychosis are less susceptible to this illusion, so they indeed see concave faces more easily than healthy subjects. So how can this explain psychotic symptoms? At least for delusions, there is a very straightforward link between this idea of abnormal weighting, relative weighting of the likelihood versus the prior. In effect, this reduced weighting of priors relative to the sensory evidence, also called weak prior hypothesis, results in aberrant salience, which means that the sensory evidence, the sensory stimuli, are imbued with too much meaning, with too much salience, because they are more surprising, because they are less predicted by priors. So every stimulus will be more salient, will be more surprising, and this aberrant salience then can give rise to, abnormal explanations of all this salience that the subject experiences, which can then give rise to delusions. There's actually a lot of empirical evidence for this weak prior hypothesis. I'm not going to go into the details of all this evidence here, but it's nicely summarized in a paper by Rick Adams in 2016, from which I took this figure here. Smooth pursuit experiments strongly suggest that priors are reduced relative to the sensory evidence. The same is true for experiments with the mismatch negativity, electrophysiological findings, and as I already mentioned, also the hollow face illusion, and some other visual illusions. So there is this evidence that, quite compatible with this idea of relatively weak priors relative to the sensory evidence. Now, when it comes to hallucinations, however, there is also evidence to the contrary, and this is basically what my talk is going to be about today. There is a lot of evidence, there has been a lot of evidence in the last couple of years for strong priors being related to hallucinatory experiences, both in healthy individuals who sometimes also hallucinate and in individuals diagnosed with pathological forms of psychosis. For example, the perception of two-tone images like this one here, once the original image has been revealed to the subject, in such experiments, people with who have a higher frequency of hallucinations and people with early psychosis have a higher probability of actually recognizing the image after being exposed to the original image. So this can be interpreted as, you know, a prior knowledge being established by viewing this original image that is then used to interpreting this fragmented information here. And there is a very famous study by Phil Collett's lab from Al Powers and colleagues who showed that conditioned hallucinations, where hallucinations, auditory hallucinations occur by pairing with a visual stimulus, that these conditioned hallucinations are more frequent in people who have hallucinations, both people with schizophrenia and also so-called psychics, healthy people who indicate that they experience hallucinations. And this, also using neuroimaging and computational modeling, has been attributed to stronger influence of priors. And there's also a lot of evidence from studies looking at pareidolia and related phenomena, for example, recognizing faces in noise, as here, where we have the prior knowledge that there may be a face. And here the same is true, that people with hallucination proneness and people with hallucinations have a higher likelihood of recognizing faces in noise using this prior knowledge that there may be a face to recognize these faces. So how can we resolve this question whether priors are actually weak or strong in psychosis? Or are there actually different types of psychosis? One type of psychosis with weak priors, another type of psychosis with strong priors. We actually suggested that the solution, the answer to this problem, is in the hierarchical nature of inference, or how inference is implemented in the human brain. So obviously Bayesian inference will not only take at one level in the brain, but at multiple levels. So if we combine the principles of Bayesian inference with this idea of hierarchical predictive coding, where predictive models are actually implemented at multiple hierarchical levels in the brain, we come up with something like this here. So this is just a summary depiction of this idea of Bayesian hierarchical predictive coding, which has been originally proposed by Mumford and Lee, and also by Carl Friston in the early 2000s. So the idea here is that at each predictive level here, basically something like Bayesian inference is happening, just the way I just introduced it to you. So how could we then explain this discrepancy between weak priors and strong priors? The one idea is that it's actually the perceptual priors or sensory priors that are reduced in precision, and that higher level priors may be compensating for these weak low level priors. So this is shown here due to some neurotransmitter abnormalities that I'm not going into the details of. It has been proposed that there is actually an imbalance in the precision of priors and sensory evidence at the low level. This is expressed by these thin and fat arrows down here. And this may be compensated by stronger high-level priors. Paul Fletcher once said that the strong high-level priors may do the job that the low levels aren't doing. So once the the low levels aren't acting properly, higher hierarchical level has to kick in, and that this results in an abnormal strength or an abnormal precision, high precision of high-level priors, which may explain not only hallucinations, but also the persistence of delusions. So the idea is of a compensation of weak low-level priors by strong high-level priors. And then the question arises, if that is the case, then weak low-level priors should actually be a general mechanistic feature of psychosis, including hallucinations. So that would actually help us to, put different findings within the same framework and perhaps include hallucinations also within this framework. So to summarize this with a figure that we published a couple of years ago, so we have here 3 levels. Of course, there are more levels in the brain, but just for illustration, we have the sensory input level, then we have a level of low-level priors and a level of high-level priors. Again, the idea would be that low-level priors are relatively weak, and that then possibly high-level priors, cognitive priors, may take over and may have a stronger influence on inference at lower levels. I want to show you now a study where we tested this hypothesis, the hypothesis of weak low-level priors, using a phenomenon that has raised a lot of interest in the last 8 years or so, the phenomenon of so-called serial dependencies or choice history bias in perceptual decision-making. Luca, I stole this slide largely from you. Thank you for providing the slide. So that's from Luca Jekyll. So the finding here about choice history bias is the following: if you present similar stimuli in a series, then and the stimuli are have some sensory uncertainty, so if there is some difficulty involved in identifying the stimulus, then the current stimulus, or the perception of the current stimulus, will be influenced by our previous percepts. So if we do, so this is illustrated here, if the past stimulus was a vertical grating and the present stimulus is a hard to detect diagonal grating, the reported present will be biased towards the to the past stimulus. So if we have several previous trials and then now a current trial, our perceptual choice at the current trial, for example, in a 2 alternative first choice trial, will be biased by our choices in previous trials. So there are several reasons to believe that this has something to do with Bayesian inference. One finding is that these choice history effects scale with perceptual uncertainty and stimulus similarity. So the more similar the similar, the higher this, or the stronger this choice history bias is, and the more uncertain the stimulus is, that the stronger the choice history biases will be. And the idea is that this is actually an adaptive way of the visual system to exploit the temporal redundancies in natural scenes, because there's a lot of autocorrelation usually in temporal autocorrelation in visual scenes. So it makes sense, or it's adaptive to assume that what I'm presented with now is somehow related or somehow similar to what I was presented with maybe a couple of seconds ago. So the idea is that recent perceptual choices are used as ad hoc priors for upcoming sensory events, in line with the idea of Bayesian inference. So we tested whether there would be a relationship between these choice history biases as an expression of the strength of perceptual priors with psychosis-pronenes. In this experiment, we didn't test patients. We just tested large cohorts of healthy individuals and also measured their psychosis-pronenes, both with respect to delusions and hallucinations. We did 2 experiments, one online, one lab-based. The first experiment, the online experiment, that was an auditory experiment where people had a task to actually discriminate between clicks presented to the left and to the right ear, and they had to make a decision as to whether more clicks were presented to the left or to the right ear. There was also a nice cover story. So we had like a gamified version of this task where actually that was framed as a contest between a fast and a slower typewriter. So the task was to decide whether the left ear and the right ear had more clicks. And then we did a similar experiment with a typical motion coherence task, a typical perceptual decision-making task that has been used numerous times, where actually a moving random dot field is presented and a certain fraction of the dots are moving in one direction. And people have to make a choice with respect to the overall direction going to the left or to the right. And this can also be very nicely titrated to the subject's performance. One particular manipulation that we did in this study here is that we had two schemes in which these stimuli were presented. Either there was a 50% chance of a different stimulus being presented in each trial. So that is a completely random sequence, or there was an 80% chance of a repetition, in which case having a choice history bias would actually be adaptive, because if you have a high probability of stimuli being repeated, it is adaptive to assume that the current stimulus is similar to the previous stimulus. And we did this manipulation in both experiments. As I said, we measured hallucination proneness and delusion proneness using standard and well-established scales, the Cardiff Anomalous Perception Scale and the Peters Delusion Inventory. We found quite some variance in our samples and high degree of correlation between the perceptual or hallucination proneness and delusion proneness. This has been shown before. And since these were so similar and highly correlated, we actually computed a psychosis-pronenes score from these two scales to actually make our analyses a little bit leaner. Okay, let's first of all look at the basic finding of the choice history bias. So in these psychometric curves here, you can see that evidence strength, both for the auditory and the visual experiment, is on the y-axis, and then the choice is presented on the on the x-axis, and the choice is presented on the y-axis. And it's very simple to read. So the larger the shift here between the green and the brown line is, the larger the choice history biases, since this will be influenced by the previous, illustrates the influence by the previous stimulus. And as you can see here, there is in both experiments, there is a very weak choice history bias. It's just judging by eyeballing here in the neutral blocks where stimuli were presented randomly, but you see a larger choice history bias in the repetitive blocks, illustrating that people actually adapted to the repetitive environment. This is just a basic analysis to illustrate this effect of choice history bias. Here is also an illustration of the actual correlation of the repetition probability, so the choice history biases, with delusion proneness. If you just look at the analysis across block types in both experiments, we do find a correlation, at least in experiment 1. And this is stronger as I said, in experiment 1 than in experiment 2. But we do find generally a correlation between the choice history bias and the psychosis-pronenes score, looking at these correlation plots. Now, the full model that we used here is a logistic choice model, because of course the choices of the subjects in each trial are influenced by a number of things here. And I just want to highlight the most important effects here. Of course, there's a strong influence by the stimulus that is trivial, but more interestingly, we did find in both experiments a quite strong effect by the previous choice. So choice T-1 had a significant effect on the current choice in terms of a positive choice history bias, as expected. Now, this choice history bias, if looking at the interaction with the block types or repetitive blocks versus neutral blocks, was also significant. The negative effect here is only due to the coding of the block type, but we do find that people significantly adapted to the block types, adapted to the regularities in the environment. Now, the key question was whether we also find an effect of psychosis-pronenes, abbreviated with PPS here, on the choice history bias. And yes, we did find such an effect in both experiments. So people with a higher psychosis-pronenes did have a larger choice history biases. Sorry, I said it the wrong way. So people with a higher psychosis-pronenes had a smaller choice history biases, speaking to a reduced influence of the previous perceptual choices. And finally, we did not find a significant effect of psychosis-pronenes on the effect of block type. So the adaptation to the regularity of the environment was not influenced by psychosis-pronenes. Now, importantly, was this specific to either hallucination-pronenes or delusion-pronenes? No, it wasn't. The effect of psychosis-pronenes on choice history bias was significant for both in a post hoc analysis. So we can safely conclude here that both psychosis-pronenes, delusion-pronenes, and hallucination-pronenes strongly contribute to this effect here in both experiments. So just to conclude, from this study, we found that choice history bias in perceptual decision-making, well, we didn't find that. That was an assumption. They can be conceptualized as Bayesian priors. We did find that they were reliably detected across sensory domains, both auditory and visual, and that they adapt to environmental statistics. And importantly, according to our hypothesis, we also found that these choice history biases were weaker in psychosis-prone individuals, both delusion and hallucination-prone individuals, which is actually supporting our hypothesis that psychosis-pronenes is associated with weak perceptual low-level priors. Now, there are some open questions. One open question that has been discussed a lot is how low-level are these choice history biases? So are they really perceptual, or are they implemented at a more decisional stage? That is one important question that we have to look into. And another important question is, how about psychosis rather than psychosis-pronenes? So do we actually find evidence for such an effect also in people with psychosis? We don't have the data in psychotic people yet, but there is a very nice study by Stein et al. In 2020 from Barcelona, where they actually showed weaker serial dependence effects in people with schizophrenia, and also in people with NMDA receptor encephalitis who also suffer from psychosis in a different task. That was a working memory task, but that speaks actually to the idea that this is more indeed a phenomenon that is also different in psychosis, not only in healthy people who are psychosis prone. We, however, have some evidence from another type of perceptual paradigm, bicivil perception. So this is the well-known phenomenon where you have one stimulus that is compatible with two or more perceptual interpretations. Here are a few examples: the well-known Necker cube or the Rubin vase, and a less famous one, the Lisa-Shu figure, which we actually used a lot in our experiments, where you have like this perception of a 3D or an object rotation in depth. And here the rotation direction is ambiguous if you look at it for a while. And this type of perception, bicivil perception, can also be modeled as Bayesian inference, whereby the currently dominant percept can be seen as a perceptual prior. So what I see now is basically a prior for what I will see in the next moment. And at the same time, there is also evidence in these stimuli for another percept, hence they are bistable. And the idea in the predictive coding or predictive processing framework is that this suppressed percept causes a prediction error that contributes to perception then switching at some point. And the nice thing about these stimuli is that you can also actually manipulate the stimulus evidence. So you can manipulate this prediction error signaling through introducing additional stimulus evidence that disambiguates the stimulus phenomenon that we call graded ambiguity. To explain this, how we implemented this Bayesian idea into the modeling of Bayesian perception, this is work by Veit Weinheimer, who was here 2 weeks ago and probably also talked about this. Therefore, I just want to mention this briefly. So the idea of this Bayesian model is, as I said, that the current percept establishes a prior, and that the currently suppressed percept causes a prediction error. And this is implemented like this. So we start with a stability prior. So the current percept, for example, here leftward rotation of the Lissajous figure is modeled as a prior with a certain height and a certain distribution. And this is then combined with a likelihood, which here expresses the two possible perceptual interpretations as a bimodal distribution with, in that case, equal distributions. And this is then combined with the stability prior to compute a posterior. And from this posterior, we can actually compute a prediction error as the difference between the posterior and the stability prior, which is then used to update our stability prior. So in the next circle, or in the next iteration here, this posterior will be used as a stability prior, will then again be combined with the likelihood to then compute a posterior that is then again more similar to the likelihood. So this prediction error signal from iteration to iteration increases and will at some point then lead to a switch in perception. So this is the basic idea here. And of course, we can not only use, as I said a moment ago, bistable stimuli that are completely ambiguous. We can also use stimuli that are disambiguated to some degree, which will then be expressed in differences in these likelihood distributions here. Veit and colleagues devised an experiment that we then used in people with schizophrenia, where we actually used this paradigm of graded ambiguity. So this is a version of this Lissajous stimulus, which is composed of several dots here. And the way we disambiguated the stimulus is to introduce just a couple of dots that carry 3D cues. So depending on the number of dots that carry these 3D cues, the stimulus will be more or less disambiguated. And the more the people follow the disambiguation in their perception, we call that congruence with the disambiguation, the more sensitive, we could say, they are to this sensory information. So here is again just a schematic of this of the basic idea. In full ambiguity, you always have the same stimulation, nothing changes, and then due to this Bayesian process that I just mentioned, the percept will at some point switch, and you will have a perceptual transition here. Now, if you have a partly disambiguated stimulus, things will look different. So if it's only partly disambiguated, you will have a stimulus that is more compatible with one interpretation, and then at some point switches to be more compatible with the other interpretation. Perception, however, will not, since it's only partly disambiguated, will not strictly follow this disambiguation, but you will have at some times perception that is congruent with the stimulus, here shown in green, and at some points you will also have perception that is incongruent with this perception, with the stimulus that is shown in red here. And the more green phases, if you will, here you have, the more congruent your perception is with the disambiguation of the stimulus. And that is a measure of how sensitive the individual is to the disambiguating information. So we used different levels of disambiguation here in our study, from level D1 to D7, where D1 is a very low level of disambiguation, D7 is very strong disambiguation. And you can see here with the controls in blue and the patients with schizophrenia in red that both actually follow the disambiguating cues, so they have a weak effect on congruence with the low level and a strong effect with the high level. But what is hard to see in this plot here, but if you use a curve fit for both groups here, you can see that there is actually a difference in how sensitive patients and controls are with respect to this disambiguating information. So this is the summary plot for the sensitivity to the disambiguating information, and you can see that there is a significant difference between patients with schizophrenia and healthy controls, whereby patients are more sensitive to the disambiguating information. So this is remarkable because, similar to the hollow face illusion, people with schizophrenia make more use of the actual sensory information and less use of the prediction or the prior that is basically, that is based on the current percept. And interestingly, this effect correlated with perceptual abnormalities, both using the Cardiff anomalous perception score and also the P3 score of the PAN score, of the clinical score. So this positive correlation here shows the sensitivity to the disambiguating information is greater in people who have a higher degree of hallucination proneness. And this is only patients shown here. So to conclude from this study, we have seen that sensitivity to disambiguating stimulus evidence can be quantified with this paradigm of graded ambiguity. This effect is greater in individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, and importantly, it correlates with the severity of hallucinations. So we can conclude from this study, as from the first study, that psychosis is indeed associated with reduced weighting of priors relative to the sensory evidence. So if it's weaker priors or stronger sensory evidence, it's hard to disambiguate, but overall, both these studies support the idea of weak low-level priors being related to hallucination proneness and hallucinations. There are still some open questions, of course, two of which I highlighted here. So one question that we're of course wondering as neuroscientists is, does this sensitivity to the disambiguating stimulus evidence really reflect a neural prediction error signal as assumed in our predictive processing model or our Bayesian model of bistable perception? So this is one question we followed up on. And the second question is, could this prediction error signaling be possibly a target for therapeutic intervention? So if indeed this higher sensitivity to disambiguating stimulus evidence is causally involved in generating hallucinatory percepts and delusions, would that be perhaps this enhanced prediction error signaling a target for possible therapeutic interventions? So at least the first question we addressed in a study that was published last year, where we again used the paradigm of graded ambiguity. Here is again the principle shown in a little bit more detail in combination with our idea of what the prediction error actually contributes to perceptual switching. So here again, full ambiguity, the stimulus stays the same all the time. It just schematically perception changes from one percept to the other over time, every couple of seconds. And our idea within this Bayesian model is that this is actually related to a constant increase in the prediction error signal that rises to a point where it gets so strong that it actually dominates perception. And then the prediction error is, of course, because we switch to the suppressed percept, is then minimized, and then it rises again and again and again. Now with graded ambiguity, we assume basically the same thing. Here we have, if we have a stimulus that is more compatible with one perceptual state, and if it's only partly disambiguated, we will still have bistable perception, but as we have seen, perception will be more often congruent with the disambiguating information of the stimulus, which is shown by these longer phases of congruent perception as opposed to incongruent perception. And what happens with the prediction error here is that of course, because there is less disambiguating information causing less prediction error, the prediction error will escalate more slowly in the congruent phases and will be escalating faster in the incongruent perception phases. So if you compare these two phases here with respect to, for example, a neural signal that we measure, then we should be able to actually isolate the neural correlates of the prediction error. So the very simple and basic hypothesis here is that prediction error signals should be increased during stimulus incongruent phases compared to the stimulus congruent perceptual states. Here's the behavioral data from this study. First of all, again, we can show very nicely that the degree of disambiguation has a strong effect on we call that signal to ambiguity ratio, on the frequency of congruent percepts. With this, in this experiment, we don't get to 100%, but to roughly 80% stimulus congruent perception. And if you look at the estimated prediction error signals, so we here used our Bayesian model of bistable perception to estimate the trial by trial prediction error in each subject. So if we look at these prediction error estimates, we find exactly what we expect, which is that overall, during incongruent perception, the estimated prediction error will be higher, and that this increases with the level of disambiguation. So the more disambiguating signal we have, the stronger the prediction error signal, or the difference in prediction error, in estimated prediction error, will be between incongruent and congruent states. Now, if we look at the neural correlate of that, what we find is the following picture here. In two independent experiments, actually, we find congruency by signal to ambiguity interaction. So basically the neural correlate of this interaction here in visual cortex, this is probably V1 and V5, but also in inferior frontal cortex, in the anterior insular bordering the frontal operculum and inferior frontal gyrus. So briefly, I call this inferior frontal cortex IFC. So this is just from the contrast of basically comparing these stimulus incongruent phases with stimulus congruent phases, and in interaction with the level of disambiguation. Now, if we look at if we do a model-based analysis where we look at the correlate of the estimated prediction error from our model, we find a very similar picture, again in two independent experiments, where we again find a very strong and significant correlate of the prediction error in the anterior insular inferior frontal cortex, and again in V5. So this is the motion sensitive area in visual cortex. And interestingly, if we look at this activity within MTV5 voxels, we find that voxels with a left preference, if we separate the voxels according to the perceptual preference, so voxels with a preference for left rotation, they actually show a stronger prediction error during perceptual states of rightward rotation, and the other way around, which nicely shows actually that the prediction error signal is basically caused by the currently suppressed percept. Now, with regard to the inferior frontal cortex, we were wondering whether this registration of the prediction error signal is actually just like a passive phenomenon, or whether this also has an influence on the perceptual interpretation of the stimulus. So what we did here is a TMS experiment. We used theta burst simulation of the right IFC to test whether this actually has an influence on the phase durations during bistable perception. So we used TMS to the inferior frontal cortex compared to the vertex, and what we did find from pre to post RTMS is that actually the phase duration after stimulation of the IFC increased significantly. meaning that we had less perceptual switches after stimulation of the inferior frontal cortex, which can be interpreted as, silencing or actually at least impairing the function of inferior frontal cortex, then having decreased influence on perceptual inference, making perceptual phase durations longer. Interestingly, this effect of TMS nicely correlated with the prediction error signal in this very region. So this again lends some support to this idea that the prediction error is causally involved in then leading to a perceptual switch. And again, confirming this idea, we did a support vector regression analysis where we tested whether we could predict the effect of TMS on perception from the prediction error representation in the brain. And here we again found that we could predict this effect of TMS best from the activity in the same regions, again showing that the IFC and also visual cortex here, again V5, seem to have an important and causal influence on perception. So inhibitory stimulation of the inferior frontal cortex reduced the frequency of perceptual switches, which suggests a causal influence of this region on perceptual inference according to this Bayesian model that I introduced. And this is interesting also with regard to a discussion that has been going on for almost 20 years now, where people have debated, I was also part of this debate, whether IFC, inferior frontal cortex, which has been found very often as a correlate of perceptual switching, is just like a bottom-up phenomenon, just signaling that something has happened in sensory cortices, or whether this activity also is causally involved in causing a switch, in causing these changes in perceptual inference. And I think it's quite a nice, the findings here offer a quite nice reconciliation of these opposing models, because if we look at the perception, the switch-related activity which has been measured in this region, this can be actually interpreted as the peak of our prediction error signal that is going on here. So possibly the IFC activity represents the peak of this escalating prediction error signal, and is therefore not only a reflection of a bottom-up signal, but as our TMS results suggest, also reflecting a top-down influence then on visual cortex. So interim conclusions number 3, our model-based fMRI study in combination with RTMS shows prediction error signaling in visual cortex and also in prefrontal cortex, in the inferior frontal cortex, which suggests a role of the IFC in registering perceptual prediction errors, a bottom-up function, and also in inducing updates of perceptual inference by a top-down mechanism. And as I said, this can help to reconciliate these feed-forward and feedback accounts, or bottom-up and top-down accounts of bistable perception. And getting back to the question I posed before I presented this study, this makes IFC an interesting potential target for therapeutic interventions in individuals with psychosis, because if this is the region that is involved in registering the prediction error and also influencing perception thereby, and if we triangulate this finding with the finding from the schizophrenia study, where we actually found a greater activity, a greater sensitivity in psychotic patients to disambiguating sensory evidence, then possibly a disruption of the processing of prediction error in this region may also be a useful therapeutic intervention to counteract this putative causal mechanism underlying psychosis. All right, so time for a general summary and conclusions. So just to remind you again, in the first study, We looked at perceptual decision-making, classical perceptual decision-making in the auditory and the visual domain, and we found cross-modal evidence for reduced perceptual choice history bias in psychosis-prone individuals, in line with the idea of weak priors in this population. In bistable perception, in this graded ambiguity paradigm, we found reduced weighting of priors relative to the sensory evidence, again, in line with this idea of weak priors. So both these effects correlated with hallucination proneness or hallucination severity in healthy individuals and patients respectively. So we can actually conclude from this that weak priors at the low level of the hierarchy, as shown again down here, may actually be a general mechanistic feature of psychosis, both in people with delusions and also in people with hallucinations. And the findings that I presented in the very beginning, speaking to strong top-down priors in hallucinations or in relation to hallucinations, may actually reflect such a compensatory mechanisms from higher levels. And that was the last bit that I showed you. Independent of psychosis, we found evidence for a key role of the inferior frontal cortex in, again, both the signaling of perceptual prediction errors and the resolution of perceptual ambiguities. So where are we heading? I think we need to do more work to actually investigate this idea of a compensatory increase of prior precision at higher hierarchical levels, also with computational modeling. So we really have to show that those individuals who have weak priors or imprecise priors at the low levels indeed show a stronger priors or an increased precision of priors at higher levels at the hierarchy, and that this is also directly related to psychotic symptoms. We have some evidence pointing this direction, but we still have a lot of work to do here to actually show that this is a candidate mechanism, especially for hallucinations. Possibly there is a role of different hierarchical levels in different forms of psychopathology. So there are patients who have strong delusions, very prominent delusions, but no hallucinations, and the other way around. So may this be due to different pathologies at different hierarchical levels? This is something that is really important to find out. And then, of course, we have some work to do with regard to the neural implementation of these putative predictive processing alterations. We can model these at the algorithmic level, but we really have to find out what the neurotransmitter abnormalities are that are the basis for these alterations. And one candidate mechanism that we're currently looking into is an NMDA receptor hyperfunction, which we study both in humans and also in collaboration with colleagues in rodents right now. And as Felix mentioned, there is a book available. I just thought because Christmas is approaching, perhaps you're still looking for a Christmas present for people who may be interested. This is about more general implications of this research with regard to how we should deal with our own beliefs and convictions and those of others, Die Illusion der Vernunft. And this are the people who have been involved in this research, in particular Annalena Eckert, who did this choice history bias perceptual decision-making study, and Veit Weinheim, who did the rest of the studies that I showed you. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for having me.